crime gets reported. And then, way down the line, a verdict comes out. But what on earth happens in between all that? Well, today, we're going to trace that exact journey. The whole complex path from a single report all the way to a final court judgment.
Right, so this is definitely not a simple straight line. It's a journey, and it's packed with specific stages, a ton of rules, and some really immense responsibilities. So how does it actually work? And maybe more importantly, what are the principles that are supposed to guide the whole thing?
To get some answers, we're going to zoom in on the legal framework of Pakistan. And we're going to do that using some new research that looks at the entire process through a Sharia-based lens, from that very first report to the final word from the judge. Okay, so at its heart, criminal justice is basically how a state keeps everything in order, right? But here's what's so fascinating about the angle this research takes. From a Sharia perspective, this isn't just some dry legal procedure. No, it's seen as a deep moral and even religious duty.
So, let's do it. Let's put this whole system right under the microscope. And when you do that, you'll see we can really break the journey down into two main phases.
The whole thing really splits into two big parts. First up, you've got what's called the executive phase. This is all about the police and their investigation. And then part two is the judicial phase. That's when the courts step in and take over to deliver a final judgment.
Let's start at the very beginning, with that first phase. This is where the executive branch, which is mostly the police, literally lays the foundation for the entire case. Everything rests on this.
So it all kicks off with something called an FIR, a First Information Report. The second that's filed, boom, an official investigation starts to gather evidence. Once the police feel they've got what they need, they put all their findings into a formal report, known as a challan, and that gets sent over to the court.
But hang on, this is where the analysis brings in a really powerful idea. From a Sharia viewpoint, all the power the state has in this phase, the power to investigate, to collect evidence, it's all considered a sacred trust. The word for it is amana.
And this idea creates a really fascinating contrast. See, standard procedure tends to focus on the rules of how you collect evidence, but the Sharia principle lifts the evidence itself up to the level of a sacred trust. What that means is, any screw-up or negligence here isn't just a simple procedural mistake. It's seen as a major breach of trust that could poison the entire system of justice.
So, what happens next? Well, once that official report from the police lands in court, the judicial phase kicks off, and the responsibility shifts completely over to the judiciary.
And this phase has its own clear set of steps too. First, the court takes cognizance, which is just a formal way of saying it's officially taking on the case. Then, a formal charge is laid out against the accused. After that, both the prosecution and the defense get to present their evidence, the accused makes their statement, and finally, the court delivers its judgment.
The guiding principle for this entire phase is just as clear and honestly, just as profound. The research points straight to this Quranic verse, which hammers home the absolute duty for judges to be totally impartial and to deliver justice. Pure and simple.
So here's where it all comes together. The research brilliantly connects each pillar of the state to a core Islamic principle. You've got the legislature, which makes the laws, but the ultimate authority is seen as belonging to God. You have the executive, which investigates, but their power is that sacred trust we talked about. And then you have the judiciary, which judges, and their non-negotiable duty is absolute justice.
Now, all of this brings up a really important question. Why was this kind of end-to-end analysis even needed in the first place? I mean, what's the gap that it's trying to fill?
Well, it turns out that while different parts of the system had been studied before, that complete big-picture view, that was seriously missing.
Yeah. See, previous studies were kind of looking at individual puzzle pieces. They'd look at the police here, or a specific law there, but very few actually followed the entire journey, from that first FIR all the way to the final verdict, and analyzed every single stage as one connected system through this Sharia lens. And that's exactly the gap this research set out to fill.
And look, filling that gap isn't just some academic exercise. The goal here is really constructive. It's about building a potential blueprint for real reform.
And honestly, this is the key takeaway. The point isn't just to poke holes and find problems. It's to actually propose solutions. The research is all about building a practical framework guided by Islamic principles to try and make the system more fair, more transparent, and just plain more effective for everybody involved.
So, what's the end game here? Well, the ultimate goal is to deliver a clear roadmap, a complete, no-stone-unturned analysis of the system, a really well-argued list of its weaknesses, and a practical model for reform that could actually help guide future policy decisions.
You know, this whole analysis leaves us with a much bigger question to chew on. By looking at a modern legal system through the lens of these timeless principles, like trust and absolute justice, it kind of forces all of us to ask, how can any legal system, anywhere in the world, draw on its own deepest values to do a better job of serving its people?